Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for honoring our invitation to be part of our research presentation this afternoon. My name is Titus Nishola, and it's my privilege to serve as the CEO of Action Research Center Limited. The project that will be presented this afternoon is titled, "What Are They Saying About Children and Domestic Violence in Australia?" And this is an important topic that touches the heart of our nation. Before we start, just a few introductions. Action Research Center is a recognized leader in high-level evidence-based research and advocacy to influence policymakers for social change in the areas of domestic and family violence, homelessness, community resilience, and asylum seekers. Action Research Center Limited is also endorsed by the Department of Education, Skills and Employment Research and Higher Education Infrastructure Branch as an approved research institute. You can know more about Action Research Center Limited through our website, www.actionresearchcenter.org.au. Welcome to the country. Action Research Center Limited and our team across Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continued connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their cultures, and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. In the same vein, we would love to acknowledge and pay our respect to the victims and survivors of domestic and family violence. We pay our respect to those who have lost their lives to domestic and family violence. We acknowledge the ongoing impact and trauma experienced by many. We hope to contribute to a future free from the pain and suffering caused by domestic and family violence, and acknowledge that we are here today on the shoulders of those who have come before us in this vital space. We know that it is only through the courage of survivors that this research exists, and we thank them for their brave contributions. As we progress today, if you do have some questions to raise, please feel free to put them in the chat. By the time we finish our presentation, we will address those questions. I will now proceed to introduce the team. On the team today, we have Alexandra Anastasov, Katie Bridgman, Kamel Khalili. Kamel leads this team. Dulcie Suranin, Linda Harvey, Patrick Abodo, and Yaran Yu. And on behalf of ARC, I want to appreciate you for everything you have done to ensure a successful presentation today. I will now hand over to Kamel to take us through the first part of the presentation. You're welcome, Kamel.
Thank you, Titus, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we start, the following presentation contains some sensitive content that may be distressing for some of our audience. So if you feel as though you need to take a break or leave the webinar for any reason, that's fine, feel free to do so. And we've also put in some contact numbers at the end of the presentation for helpline services. Now, before we begin, it's important to go over key definitions of domestic and family violence that we will be using throughout this presentation. In Australia, the terms domestic violence and family violence differ across state and territories. Our team has adopted the definitions that are used in the 2009 National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, which was released by the Council of Australian Government. Until recently, this was a forum that was between federal, state and territorial governments in Australia, which was then replaced by the National Cabinet in 2020. Here, the broad definition of domestic violence is acts of violence that occur between people who have had an intimate relationship. Typically, one partner attempts to exert power or control over the other through acts of intimidation and fear. This abuse can be physical, sexual, verbal, economic, emotional, social, or spiritual. Family violence, on the other hand, is a broader term that refers to violence between family members, whether they be between siblings or cousins, between parent and child, intimate partners, or any other kinships. The term family violence is the preferred term for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as it covers extended families and kinship relationships where the violence may occur. Now, in the past, children have been referred to as forgotten or secondary victims when exploring children's exposure to domestic family violence. However, there is an increasing body of research that is dedicated to exploring the effects of domestic family violence on children. Now, our research looks at bringing this issue into light, and we are answering the question, what are they saying about children and domestic and family violence in Australia? Our research aims are as follows. Firstly, to better understand the outcomes of children exposed to domestic and family violence in Australia. Next, to identify any existing gaps in the literature. And finally, to identify an appropriate methodology and scope to determine the direction of future research projects for Action Research Centre. Now, when we talk about children and domestic and family violence, we find that the extent of domestic family violence is often underestimated. This is particularly the case when we use terms like witnessing or exposure to domestic family violence, which doesn't really cover the reality that is faced by children. So underreporting of domestic and family violence and children's involvement in the violence also adds to this underestimation of the impact on children. The prevalence of domestic and family violence is therefore difficult to determine in Australia. So looking at statistics do suggest that the rate of domestic and family violence is quite high, particularly where parental separation is prevalent. The Australian Bureau of Statistics found in its 2016 Personal Safety Survey that 68% of women and 60% of men reported that their child had seen or heard incidences of domestic violence perpetrated against them by their former partners. This is in comparison to 50% of women who reported that their children witnessed abuse by current partners, suggesting that domestic family violence is a cause for parental separation, but we have to remember that this is not always the case. The impact of this domestic and family violence on children's outcomes is quite significant. Numerous papers found higher rates of anxiety, depression, and aggression in children as a result, as well as lower scores in health, well-being, and learning outcomes. These findings will be presented further by the rest of the team, but for now I'm going to pass it on to Katie. She's going to present our research methods and data selections. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmel. So I'm just going to provide a brief overview of our research process. The databases included in our initial search of literature are listed on the slide before you now. These were chosen as they broadly encompass the areas of psychology, health, social sciences, humanities, and other disciplines, which collectively incorporate the study of domestic and family violence in Australia. Our broad search terms included domestic and family violence, children, and Australia. The results of these were then uploaded into Rayan, which is an online systematic review screening platform from which initial title and abstract screening was conducted by at least 2 independent reviewers with the following inclusion criteria. The papers included in our review were limited to those published in the English language, including studies conducted in Australia or including an Australian sample. These papers were either peer-reviewed articles or published by a peak body in the domestic and family violence research space. Each of these studies needed to explore the effects of domestic and family violence on children as a primary focus of the study. So for an example of some exclusions, studies examining child abuse in general or measuring child maltreatment without identifying the relationship between children and perpetrators as a family relationship, or measuring witnessing family violence as one of many factors were excluded. The studies themselves needed to self-define that their focus was on domestic and family violence. Similarly, studies that examined the impact of legal reform or the family court system on children, but did not include a direct measure of child outcomes, were excluded from our number. So this resulted in 965 papers, which were the results of our initial searches. After duplicates were removed, we had 643 papers to be screened. So from these, 57 progressed to full text screening. So that was after the title and abstract screening. And from these, a further 28 papers were excluded, primarily on the basis that they did not focus on the effects of domestic and family violence on children's outcomes. So they might have focused on the mother's outcomes instead. Overall, 26 papers met our selection criteria. 16 of these were quantitative studies, 7 were qualitative studies, 1 was a mixed method study, and 2 were grey articles. The dates of publication of these ranged from 1992 to 2021. A quality analysis was performed, again, by 2 independent reviewers on each of the included papers, and a rating of low, medium, or high quality was assigned to each paper through the use of a relevant quality assessment tool with previously established validity for each type of study. So there was one for our quantitative, for our qualitative, for the grey literature, and for the mixed methods paper. The overall number of participants represented in our review was 119,632. This included a small percentage of male participants and also a small percentage of adults who had experienced childhood domestic and family violence. Although over half of the participants are listed as children, it should be noted that these children were often listed as participants where their mothers were included in the study, or in a couple of larger population studies examining the prevalence. So this does not mean that they were directly involved with the study. Of the 26 included studies in our review, only 3 examined children's own words or included self-completed child assessments or questionnaires. 7 of the 26 studies used adult samples to reflect on childhood experiences or longer-term impacts of childhood exposure to domestic and family violence. The majority of studies, therefore, included caregiver completed assessments or questionnaires to assess their children's outcomes. Only 5 of the included 26 studies included an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander sample. So the types of measures included, or the types of measures that we used within the studies are broadly classified here for you. They were mainly focusing on emotional and behavioural difficulties. Childhood trauma was also measured. Mental health impacts with depression and anxiety, measured in later life, developmental outcomes, including language ability. So a checklist of children's communication skills and vocabulary tests. There was also maternal-child relationship and children's experiences more generally examined through thematic analysis of structured interviews. Okay, so we have then performed a thematic analysis on our included papers, and we did this using In Vivo, which is a thematic analysis software. At least 2 researchers examined each paper in full to extract the relevant findings for analysis. These extracted findings were then collated in vivo, and the picture seen here on this slide represents all the themes identified in this process. Each colour represents a different theme, and the team then consulted on which themes were large enough and contained enough relevant data to be included in our overall list. As you can see, there have been some consistently larger themes, and there were also a couple of very small themes which were either combined to create a larger theme or excluded. So, our list of final identified themes on the following slide, and they include domestic and family violence and children's emotional and behavioural development, including the sub-themes of mental health, language development, school readiness and success, and physical well-being. We also identified the intergenerational transmission of violence as one of our central themes, as well as the maternal protection strategies and their effects on relationship between mother and child. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander domestic and family violence also emerged as a theme of its own, and witnessing intimate partner violence versus being a target of the violence itself. And lastly, the effects of parental separation on children's outcomes were identified as our themes. So as you can see from the table on this slide, most of the papers, or some of the papers, only appeared in one theme, and others appeared across multiple themes with a maximum of 3. I will now hand over to Patrick to begin our analysis of these identified themes. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Katie. The link between children experiencing domestic and family violence and having emotional behavioral development issues was a common theme in the research. Exposure to intimate partner violence in year 1 postpartum was associated with maternal depressive symptoms in year 4, which in turn was associated with emotional behavioral development issues 6 years later. This was significant even when accounting for concurrent intimate partner violence exposure with economic disadvantage worsening outcomes. Witnessing intimate partner violence was also directly and significantly associated with child emotional behavioral development, but to a lesser extent. This finding was supported in another study that found that mothers who experienced intimate partner violence reported that their children had significantly more behavioral and emotional difficulties compared to mothers that didn't experience intimate partner violence. This was even after adjusting for maternal depression and other social characteristics. The worst outcomes were when the intimate partner violence exposure was both early and ongoing. Child maltreatment, such as sexual, physical, psychological abuse, neglect, and witnessing family violence were also associated with children's adjustment issues. However, quality relationships, especially with a mother, having a place of safety and no longer being exposed to intimate partner violence improved children's emotional and behavioral outcomes. In terms of mental health, depression was seen as one of the most prevalent outcomes for children exposed to domestic and family violence. Part of this is linked to neglect, which is the most common form of child maltreatment, and much of this is attributed to parents being preoccupied with infighting to take care of their children, and mothers being emotionally drained from the abuse and becoming emotionally distant. Their children may feel isolated and powerless, and this leads to depressive symptoms. Neglect was also found to be a unique predictor for self-deprecation, which is linked to low self-esteem, while depressive symptoms can also come about as a correlate for violent socialization. Other studies, however, have found that the relationship between domestic and family violence and childhood depression isn't so clear, with many other interrelated variables such as maternal depression and anxiety. Anxiety was also another common mental health issue for children, with witnessing intimate partner violence at 14 for boys being associated with anxiety disorder at age 21. Girls also experienced significantly higher rates of hypervigilance, while a nagging worry was a common outcome for girls that experienced domestic and family violence. Longitudinal studies have also found that early exposure to interparental conflict was associated with increased internalizing and externalizing issues for children entering adolescence. These internalizing symptoms include being withdrawn and feeling anxious, nervous, or irritable, and they can manifest into concentration problems or the child not talking. Typical externalizing behaviors include aggression, disruptiveness, impulsivity, and defiance. 20% of children exposed to domestic violence also met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, which includes hypervigilance and distressing thoughts or memories. I will now pass it to Alexandra, who will talk about language development.
Thanks, Patrick. There is growing evidence to suggest that domestic and family violence in early childhood may lead to poorer child language development skills. Poor language skills may impact individuals in a multitude of ways across childhood to adulthood. This includes impacts to their mental health, engagement in school activities, interpersonal competencies, and forming and sustaining relationships. There is support for the relationship between exposure to interparental violence in early childhood, maternal depressive symptoms, and impacts on a child's language development at age 10. On a broader community level, children whose mothers had experienced interparental violence during their child's first 4 years were more likely to have poorer language skills than children whose mothers did not experience interparental violence. Interparental violence exposure in the first 12 months of life was associated with poorer pragmatic and general language development, whereas at 4 years it was associated with poorer pragmatic language and receptive vocabulary development. While there is generally no evidence to suggest that language development differs across genders, one particular study found that the relationship between exposure to interparental conflict and general language difficulties was more significant among boys. However, the authors noted that it is unclear why no differences were observed in other language categories, and thus more research is needed in order to provide greater insight into this phenomenon. Children's exposure to domestic and family violence also has negative implications for children's school readiness and success. One study found that 23% of children exposed to interparental conflict experienced poorer school readiness in comparison to 14% of children in the group that had not been exposed to interparental conflict. In addition, poorer outcomes are also recorded for children exposed to interparental conflict in attaining the skills required for school success. For instance, poor outcomes in literacy were recorded for 22 to 25% of children who were exposed to interparental conflict, in comparison to 13% of children who were not exposed to interparental conflict. In addition to literacy, poorer math outcomes were also recorded among children exposed to interparental conflict. After accounting for parental age, education, socioeconomic status, and success among children who were exposed to interparental conflict in comparison to children who were not exposed to interparental conflict. A limited amount of studies examine the association between children's exposure to domestic and family violence and physical health outcomes. Poor physical health outcomes are understood to be as a result of both direct and non-direct exposure to domestic and family violence. The small number of studies that have analysed this association indicate that children exposed to domestic and family violence are more likely to have poorer physical health outcomes than children not exposed to domestic and family violence. One study that compares the outcomes of children who have and have not been exposed to interparental conflict found a notable difference in their physical health outcomes. It found that 23 to 32% of children who were exposed to interparental conflict experienced poor physical health in comparison to 11 to 14% of children who had not been exposed to interparental conflict. Among those that had been exposed to interparental conflict, the proportion with poor physical health tended to be slightly more significant among children in the age 12 to 13 group. In addition to poorer physical health outcomes generally, it was found that children exposed to domestic and family violence are more likely to be hospitalized than children not exposed to domestic and family violence. Reasons for hospitalization included mental health issues, pregnancy-related issues, gastrointestinal problems, and injury as a result of direct exposure to domestic and family violence. Notably, among children exposed to domestic and family violence, Aboriginal children are more likely to be hospitalized in comparison to non-Aboriginal children. However, these findings are likely to be as a result of contextual factors not measured within the particular study, such as increased stresses as a result of intergenerational trauma. The literature suggests that there are a number of explanations as to why domestic and family violence may lead to poorer physical health outcomes among children. Exposure to domestic and family violence is considered one of the most prevalent stresses children experience. The biological mechanisms that relate stress to poor physical health outcomes among children are not fully understood. However, evidence suggests that stress caused by domestic and family violence can impact physiological response systems. A further explanation for children's poor physical health outcomes is that parents may not regularly take the child to a medical practitioner for fear that the domestic and family violence will be detected. I will now pass on to Patrick, who will present our theme of intergenerational transfer of violence.
Thank you, Alexandra. We found that domestic and family violence abusers taking part in intervention programs typically had a history of family violence and attribute part of that to their own abusive behavior. Some have even taken part in abusing their mothers at an early age. Specifically for boys, witnessing family violence has been found to be a unique predictor of committing psychological domestic violence in their adult relationships. One of the key factors we found with how domestic and family violence perpetuates itself is how it impacts maternal parenting, and in turn, how that impacts children's outcomes. It must, however, be stressed emphatically that these findings, or how it's presented, do not place blame on the mother, but on the abuse and violence they constantly endure. As such, some of the studies have found that mothers who grew up in an abusive environment struggled in their capacity to parent their own children. On top of that, mothers who experienced constant interparental conflict were found to have higher levels of irritability and inconsistency, and sometimes presented as less warm towards their children. Similarly, some mothers who experienced intimate partner violence were found by researchers to be more hostile and coercive towards their sons. Abused mothers were also found to experience problems ascertaining the needs of their children and fulfilling them compared to mothers that hadn't experienced domestic and family violence. These difficulties, in conjunction with the child's own reaction to the family violence they experience, may contribute to poorer outcomes for children. Researchers have also found that in some cases, the resiliency gained by children through positive maternal parenting is lost for children with abused mothers, and unfortunately can compound the abuse they may already experience from their fathers. Aside from neglect, these difficulties in parenting are linked to violent socialization because mothers are hindered in their ability to shield their children from the abuse, while some mothers readily accept the blame to protect their child. This strategy can have a number of adverse effects, such as normalizing and facilitating generational abuse. Both neglect and violent socialization are strong predictors of future intimate partner violence victimization for girls, while childhood neglect for boys was uniquely associated with committing physical intimate partner violence. We also found that maternal parenting and the strategies employed by abused mothers to protect their children from domestic and family violence has had varying effects on their relationship with their child. A lot of this stems from children resenting their mothers for not escaping the violent relationship or returning if they do, but many don't consider the financial barriers, social and cultural stigma, as well as the physical threats from their abusers. Financially, 76% of mothers reported at least one form of financial adversity 1 year after separation, with many experiencing multiple instances of financial insecurity. This has been found to be associated with lower satisfaction in the child-parent relationship and greater maternal stress. Studies have also shown that domestic and family violence can negatively impact nurturing parental practices, which leads to worse outcomes for children living in an abusive environment. This can be seen with mothers being worn down by their abuser, which can lead to them just acquiescing to the abuse they experience. This may sometimes be intended as a strategy to reduce conflict, but it may ironically just reinforce further violence, as the abuser may believe that they are correct and justified in their actions. This is supported by the finding that maternal psychological distress had a bidirectional association with interparental conflict. Meanwhile, because the child isn't able to understand the mother's perspective, they may come to blame them as well, thus straining the relationship. Mothers whose well-being wasn't compromised from abuse, however, had more nurturing parenting and better outcomes for children living with intimate partner violence. Those who are more engaged with their children may also be more likely to explain the domestic and family violence that their children are exposed to, which can lead to them having a greater understanding of what's occurring. This is important because children are being found to feel powerless and helpless when they don't understand why violence is happening in their families and why they just can't escape it. When this occurs, many children end up leaving their families, and when they get older, they refuse to reconnect with their mothers. Carmel will now talk about domestic and family violence experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
Thank you, Patrick. Now, when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's experiences, the impact of domestic and family violence must be understood within a context of a history of colonisation, forced child removal, and intergenerational trauma. One study notes that this has led to high rates of unemployment, feelings of hopelessness, and alcoholism within these communities. Specifically, looking at alcoholism, we identified an association with heavy alcohol consumption and physical violence. Children who live in a household where there is heavy or harmful drinking had greater than 4 times the likelihood of experiencing alcohol-related injury or violence. Alcoholism and a lack of resources were found to be the primary reasons that prevented children from going to school, which in turn impacts children's educational outcomes. Being in an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander family is one of the 4 main predictive variables for persistent parental conflict, the others being maternal psychological distress, language other than English spoken at home, and low parental education. A link between levels of education and violence was also identified within these populations. Fathers who had a Year 9 or lower level of education had more than double the rates of partner violence compared to fathers who had education levels at Year 10 or higher. Additionally, when it comes to employment, mothers in Indigenous families who had partners that were unemployed were twice as likely to experience abuse than those with partners that were employed. Where Indigenous children were reported by their parents to have been distressed by family conflict, they were found to have significantly higher scores in social and emotional difficulty, with the effect being larger for those whose families had arguments that were violent. Now, while these experiences are common across all demographics, living in the most remote Indigenous communities was the strongest single predictor of partner violence for Indigenous Australian families. This, however, was not always found to be a significant factor for those that were not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. Now, as mentioned earlier, there is limited examination in the literature as to the differences in outcomes as a result of the different ways that children experience domestic and family violence. That is, whether they are a witness to the violence or a direct target of it. Now, while it's important to note that there is often an overlap where children can both be a target of and witness to domestic and family violence, there are distinct similarities and differences in outcomes between these 2 experiences. So children who witness or are targeted by domestic and family violence both show high levels of depression and anxiety and increased internalizing and externalizing behaviours. For children who are specifically targeted by violence, we see a number of additional outcomes. Girls who experience child sexual abuse and had mothers that did not acknowledge the abuse had experienced isolation and powerlessness, and as a result, depression. These girls who experienced familial sexual abuse also reported lower levels of satisfaction in current intimate relationships than those who were abused by non-family members. We also found this group had more than double the rates of divorce compared to women who did not report child sexual abuse at all. When it comes to boys, they were found to have experienced higher rates of physical abuse compared to girls, and specifically had higher rates of internalizing and externalizing behaviours than girls. Now, it's important to note that targets of domestic family violence don't necessarily have poorer outcomes than those who only witness family violence, but they may experience a compounding effect from both witnessing and direct exposure. We'll now pass it on to Linda, who's going to present our final theme on the effects of parental separation. Thank you.
So we have found that outcomes for the child depend on whether the mother and child are able to be separated from the abuser. One study found that children who were separated but still had some contact with their fathers were more likely to report depressive symptoms. Further, it was found that children's repeated exposure to intimate partner abuse in years 1 and 4 led to a greater likelihood of emotional and behavioural difficulties, while children who were only exposed in year 1 had the fewest emotional and or behavioural issues. In contrast to these negative impacts, one study found that after exposure to intimate partner violence in early life, children developed greater emotional behavioural resilience. However, this was dependent on the child no longer being exposed in years 3 and 4. It must, however, be acknowledged that separation itself does not necessarily mean the end of the conflict, with the ex-partner often continuing their abuse, especially in cases where they still have contact with their child. Overall, it has been found that both disruption in family functioning through separation or divorce and remaining in a dysfunctional family during childhood leads to psychological maltreatment, which in turn leads to adjustment problems through childhood and into adulthood.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So I'm just now going to provide an overview of our main findings from our thematic analysis. So I'm sure it comes as no surprise to those here that domestic and family violence has a pervasive effect on children's health and developmental outcomes, impacting their mental and physical health, language development, and school readiness. Depression and anxiety have been identified through the literature as the most common forms of mental health issues experienced by these. It also is unsurprising that both witnessing and experiencing family violence in childhood was found to have a significant negative effects for individuals extending into their adulthood. The poor outcomes for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children need to be understood in the context of ongoing impacts of colonisation, compounding the violence they may experience, as well as creating barriers to supports such as education and healthcare. The literature has shown that children may continue to experience negative impacts from domestic and family violence, such as depressive symptoms, regardless of whether they continue to have contact with their abusive parent following separation or not. However, when mothers and children can successfully separate from an abusive father, their long-term emotional behavioural resilience is increased. And the earlier the parents separate, the better the outcomes for the child. Another finding we believe is important is the strength and resilience children can develop and demonstrate even while experiencing domestic and family violence and abuse. Importantly, the efforts of mothers to protect their children and strengthen the mother-child relationship can reduce the negative outcomes experienced by their children. The literature has shown that the best outcomes for children can occur when their mothers or caregivers provide a nurturing parenting environment and explain the abuse that they are all living through. While these findings may not be surprising to most of us here, we believe that the most interesting finding for our review is what is missing from the literature. Linda will address these gaps for us shortly, but before she does, I will now provide a quick summary of what we believe to be the strengths and limitations of our current work, keeping in mind that this project is not yet finalised and remains a work in progress. So in using the integrative review format, which combined qualitative and quantitative research, we believe that we can provide a clear picture of the current published research on this topic in Australia. The deliberate choice to include child outcomes measured either directly by themselves, their mothers, or by researchers was made with the hope of amplifying the needs of children as victims and survivors in their own right. Consistent with the recent shifts in the family violence sector to include children as individual victims connected yet separate from their mothers, we selected only studies that measured child outcomes alone, as opposed to studies that combined child's outcomes with their mothers. This resulted in the inclusion of a broad range of child outcomes across various fields such as psychology, social work, and development studies. Therefore, we believe that our review provides a timely update in this space. Our review shares the limitations of the studies that it includes. Specifically, as is common with most research in the field, the women and children who have participated in these studies have almost all engaged with support services. This means that children and families who have not or never seek help remain hidden from this research. Another limitation afforded by the nature of the relevant literature is the comparatively small size of children's outcomes literature compared with the overall literature on domestic and family violence in Australia more broadly. The active choice to focus on child outcomes as directly measured by researchers, mothers, or children themselves results in the exclusion of worker perspectives from our current review. While we choose to define these as outside the scope of our current review, we do acknowledge that family violence workers and professionals working with children possess a wealth of knowledge on children and the effects of domestic and family violence. I will now hand back to Linda, who will provide our conclusion.
Thank you, Katie. So, in terms of gaps that exist in the literature, one of the largest may be the lack of research on culturally and linguistically diverse Australians. Indeed, non-English speaking mothers are often excluded from studies in order to simplify data collection. This is a significant gap, as one study found that speaking a language other than English at home was one of the 4 main predictors of persistent interparental conflict. Perspectives of male victims of domestic and family violence, as well as those in same-sex relationships, are also heavily underrepresented. The experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples also need further investigation, with much of the Australian literature having low numbers of Indigenous Australian participants. Similar to the culturally and linguistically diverse Australians, being a child with Indigenous Australian status was one of the 4 factors associated with twice the likelihood of persistent parental conflict. Future research should aim to fill these gaps. In particular, we recommend a specific study investigating the experiences of culturally and linguistically diverse Australians within the space of domestic and family violence, focusing specifically on children's outcomes. While our review has included some previously published qualitative research, we recommend these efforts be extended and the addition of new research examining children's autonomy and own voices be included. Also, many of the studies in our review call for early intervention policies for children and women exposed to domestic and family violence to help address the barriers to leaving, which compound over time. As the first of its kind, the key contribution of our review is our specific focus on children's outcomes, as well as integrating data from both qualitative and quantitative studies. Overall, this provides a clear picture of the literature for outcomes directly regarding children. We would like to end by thanking you all for attending this afternoon. This is a project we've been working on for many months and a topic we all care about deeply. We know some of you may have had your lives touched by domestic and family violence, and we have included the numbers of relevant services that can help you if you have found anything today particularly distressing or would like some help. While we have spent much time critiquing, evaluating, and summarizing this research, we would like to ground our findings in the knowledge that each of the statistics and numbers of participants is a person who has experienced some form of abuse and suffering. We are inspired by the courage of survivors and the desire to contribute to real change. Action Research Centre is primarily motivated in this review to establish what is known and how we can contribute to improving the lives of Australian women and children. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So that concludes our presentation for today. We'd like to thank you all for coming. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to get in touch with us through Action Research Centre. We've got the contact information listed on the slide in front of you. This is a work in progress. It's taken a lot of hours and commitment from our team. It's been fantastic to work with the team, and we do really care about this project. So we would appreciate feedback. We look forward to feedback. And if you would like to see the finished product when we do finally pull it together for our publication, please get in contact, and we'll ensure that we make access for you for the final product. As well as if you would like to look at the slides again or anything like that, then please get in contact and we will get back to you and chase that up. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you in future Action Research Centre events.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. We will be making the presentation available to everyone who has registered free. So be expecting to receive a copy of today's presentation over the next couple of days. And also when the video is also available, we'll make it, we'll send it across to everyone. And we believe that this will also assist more people to continue to reflect on this subject. So thank you again for being our guest today. And we appreciate your presence, and we can see some contribution, some comments coming in, mostly on appreciating the presentation. So please stay in touch and stay safe and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.